My name is Josie DiChiara, and I'm going to struggle with this mic for a minute. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Alzheimer's Foundation of America, and on behalf of our President and CEO, Chuck Fuschillo, our Chairman of the Board, Bert Brodsky, our board members, our staff that's here, welcome. This is the Educating Americans Word. Vegas is actually our 30th tour stop on a multi-stage tour. I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. I'm going to start with the test. Can everyone please pull out your journals? If you don't have a journal, please raise your hand. You can't hear me? Now can you hear me? Be right up on the mic. All right, does everyone have their journals out? Everybody good? Everybody can hear me? Everybody have a pen in your hand? You didn't think you were going to be tested first thing in the morning. Okay, we're going to put 3 minutes up on the screen, and we're going to ask you to please complete the puzzle. Your time starts now. Already there's moaning. You have 3 minutes, not days. No cheating. And I promise I won't be annoying and say things like, you have 2 minutes and 20 seconds to go. I love the teamwork going on at the Boyer Law Group table. Seconds. Okay, pens down. Why is everyone laughing? All right, show of hands, how many people completed the puzzle? I saw you guys over there. I'm going to show you a little video to explain why we put you through this first thing in the morning. Get the video up?
This puzzle has a special story behind it. Only one person knows all the answers, but she doesn't remember them anymore.
disease. We wanted to demonstrate its effects and show how the AFA can help. So we took a common hobby and transformed it into a way of experiencing the disease. First, we learned facts about patients' lives by interviewing their relatives.
My grandmother is Catherine. She had forgotten to feed the dog. She found a doll, named it. My dad's name is Richard. My name is Dad. Completely burned the fried chicken.
Then, we had Will Shorts create puzzles based on each patient's life and the answers they can no longer find. We worked with the biggest newspapers in the United States to have the puzzles covertly published, making enthusiasts struggle to find the simplest answers. In addition to the newspapers, a range of media drove people online, where they could learn more about how the AFA can provide support. We showed the effects of Alzheimer's through a crossword puzzle that not a single person can solve. We reached over 5 million newspaper readers, a total of 50 million adding other media. AFA saw a 159% increase in web traffic and another 62% in calls. And with unsolvable crossword puzzles, we helped many find the answers they needed.
Everybody feel better now that you didn't have the puzzle answers? So as I said, we were founded 17 years ago by a caregiver. His mom had the disease, and at that time, there was nowhere for him to go. Sorry? Oh, I'm right up on the mic. We won't have this problem when Dr. Cummings takes the stage, I promise. He wanted to establish a place where you can go when this disease enters your life for education, for resources, and for support. And that's what the AFA is. We were founded 17 years ago. We currently have 2,800 member offices across the country. Through our National Memory Screening Program and our partners at Kmart, we've been able to do memory screenings for over 5 million people. We are offering free memory screenings today, so if you are interested in getting screened, see Jeannie in the back. Turn your heads, you'll see Jeannie waving to everybody. See Jeannie and she can schedule the memory screening. It's quick, it's easy, it's painless. Somebody asked me if it hurt. It doesn't hurt. It's a 10-minute oral exam, essentially. And as I said, our partners at Kmart are here today, and they are going to be doing the screenings. Before we turn it over to our keynote speaker, Dr. Jeff Cummings, I wanted to show you one more video which outlines a little bit more about who the Alzheimer's Foundation of America is and what we do.
My last 8 years in the city, and for my brother's last 11 years in the city, we took Sam out to lunch once a month. So we had a routine. We'd meet him at the diner around the corner from his apartment, and the first time it was really dawned on us that there was an issue is when he didn't show up. We were scared, we were running around, and then we finally went and saw him in his apartment. He just forgot about it. And from then it was kind of like progressively a downward spiral. And then when we knew it was a major issue was when he was cooking and forgot to turn his stove off. And at that point it was, we have a real issue here, and we need to start looking for resources to help us navigate through this and figure out a solution for him. Sam was a young boy when the Holocaust broke out. He was living in Poland with his family. He was brought to 3 or 4 different death camps and was able to survive all of them.
Concentration camps, ghettos, liberated by the American forces.
He's lived an unbelievable life. He's an inspiration to me every time I see him. It's really troubling when you're watching someone and they're losing their mental capabilities, and they're losing their memories, and they're losing who they are as a person. It strips everything that you built an entire life for and everything you became, and it turns you into someone that you're not. It's a debilitating disease that it's going to affect you, and it's going to change the person that you are, both mentally and physically. And it also has a great effect on your family members, because it's very difficult to watch someone that you love go through such a tough time. He's probably written his life story 35 times. I think it's because he doesn't want people to forget what he's been through. And it's just so ironic that as his disease has taken over his life, he's starting to forget his own memories. And so here it starts, and it's talking about him and his life, and then we're a third of the way through the book, and he starts over. And so he writes his name, that he was born on December 1st, 1922, and then it goes through his whole story once again. Told me he was scared. He knew he was starting to lose it, and his memory was starting to go. He was vocal to me and said, I need help. And I need to get out of my apartment, and I can't live by myself anymore. Dancing it's his pleasure. Dancing to music is what it makes him happy, it makes him tick. He used to be very active. He was always going to the senior centers in the city. He was around people, he was dancing, he was happy, he was loving life. So where Sam is now, he can't dance anymore. He hasn't been dancing for the last year. And the hope is when he moves into the facility, he'll be able to start dancing again. I'm having a network of people to tap into, the Alzheimer's Foundation. They introduced me to a group of nurses that have been able to take care of my uncle. For a man that's been able to, beat almost everything else, to know that this is one he ultimately isn't going to be able to beat, it's tough, but there's hope. There's hope for him to find a cure. There's hope to make the rest of his days on Earth better. What I think will make his life more enjoyable is getting into an assisted living facility where they have the tools and the resources to help people in his situation. No matter what hand you're dealt, it's really your attitude and the way that you go through life that's gonna, ultimately decide the way that you live your life. And as long as we keep on fighting, there's hope.
So that's Uncle Sam. Happy to say that we were able to place Uncle Sam in one of our member organizations back in New York, where he gained 15 pounds, gained a girlfriend, and he got to dance. Safely. Yeah. I'm not sure which came first, the girlfriend or the 15 pounds, but either way, he was happy. So that's part of what we do at the AFA, and being able to get Sam to a place where he could dance and he was happy and he was himself was amazing for us. So, without further ado, I'd like to get things started and like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Cummings. Dr. Cummings is a world-renowned Alzheimer's researcher and leader of clinical trials. He has received numerous awards for his research and leadership contributions in the field of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Cummings is the director of the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health, professor of medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine, and many other things, including being a member of the Alzheimer's Foundation of America's Medical, Scientific, and Memory Screening Advisory Board. Please give a welcome to Dr. Jeffrey Cummings.
Thank you, Josie. Am I close enough here? Okay, good. My voice sounds like Wolfman Jack from up here. Welcome to the radio. So it's a pleasure to be here with the Alzheimer Foundation. I still serve on the board. I think they do great work, and I'm glad to see you here to share the work that they do in this national tour. 30 cities. Can you imagine 30 cities? I admire their fortitude. So I have just one task today, which is to answer your questions about Alzheimer's disease. So I put together a few slides, but I don't want this to turn into a slideshow. I'm here to answer your questions, so I put together some things that I thought you might find interesting or important or informative. But what I really want to do is make sure that when you leave today, you feel like you understand Alzheimer's disease better. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll correct just one thing that Josie said. Josie said I was the director of the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health. That was true until about 4 months ago when I stepped down from the directorship I continue at the Cleveland Clinic part-time, and now I've started a new program at UNLV, and we'll have a new department of brain health at UNLV, so I'm very happy about that. So here are my disclosures. The reason I know a lot about drugs is because I work with a lot of companies who are developing drugs, and here they are. Questions I thought might be interesting to try to answer today are, what is Alzheimer's disease? Our concept of Alzheimer's disease has changed profoundly in the last decade. One of the things we've learned is that Alzheimer's disease begins much earlier than we thought, usually in the 50s. I'll tell you how that works. New therapies are coming, but they're not here yet. They might be here pretty soon. I want to give you a little hope today as part of my goal. And I'm going to end by talking about how a brain-healthy lifestyle can reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease and your family's risk for Alzheimer's disease. I think that's a worthy message. So what's Alzheimer's disease? It's many things, isn't it? Many of you are here because you have a personal experience with the disease. Maybe you're even struggling with the disease. So it's a personal loss and it's a family tragedy. From a population and public health perspective, it's a tsunami, right? There's 5 million people. That's what we learned from Josie this morning. 5 million people in the United States have Alzheimer's disease, 13 million worldwide. By 2050, it'll be about 13 million in the United States and about 100 million worldwide. 100 million people. It's an incredible number. It's a socioeconomic catastrophe. It costs our country about $250 billion a year to care for Alzheimer's disease. So it's a huge investment. It is, and this is, of course, my take on it, it's a neurodegenerative disease, so it's a specific brain disease. It's not normal aging, it's a brain disease. And it's a huge unmet therapeutic need. It is, of the top 10 diseases in the world, it's the only one that we do not have a substantial treatment for. So try to take you through some of these things. I'm going to emphasize, of course, the medical aspects of these because I'm a doctor. So it's a progressive brain disease. And it has a lot of things going on in the brain. That's one of the things that's made it difficult to treat. It's not just one thing going on in the brain, it's a bunch of things. So there's a protein called amyloid that accumulates. And we are all making amyloid right now. It's going through our blood and through our brain. And hopefully, we're also clearing it out of the brain. But there will be a few in here who, for various reasons, are not clearing it normally, and they will get Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease results from the accumulation of this protein in the brain, and it's a very normal protein. But in the course of aging, some people fail to clear it normally, and they get Alzheimer's disease. And there are some reasons, there are some known reasons that happens, some unknown reasons. It leads to a second protein in the brain called tau, and that has a tangle, so we have plaques and tangles. Those are the two main changes in the brain. And that leads to the loss of brain cells, which causes a memory problem, and loss of chemical transmission between the cells, and that contributes to the memory problem. And one of the things I thought I'd add this year, because we're really excited about this, is that the brain becomes inflamed. You know, just like your arthritis or something, you know how your knee swells up when you twist it, and it gets all inflamed, and that inflammation contributes to the redness and the pain. Well, that's going on in the brain of the Alzheimer patient, and we now think that might be a really great part of what we can do from a treatment perspective. So we're thinking about how to treat the inflammation of the brain in Alzheimer's disease. So this is a little bit what it looks like. There's a plaque at the top. That's the amyloid that's accumulating in the brain, and then it tangles. We have plaques and tangles. and we have some inflammation and the loss of cells and the loss of chemical transmitters. So when we think about the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, these are the things we're trying to treat in the brain. Now, one really great thing about the brain is it's inside the skull. So that protects it, but it also makes it very difficult to work on. It's one of the challenges that we have to face in neurology. Now, one of the really great things that has happened in just the last few years is that we now have brain scans that can show us plaques and tangles. Right? Until now, if we wanted to treat a plaque, we'd give it a drug and keep our fingers crossed that it was doing what we wanted. All right? Now, I can do a scan. This person has the amyloid protein in the brain. Let's give them the drug. Now let's scan them again. Let's see whether the protein is gone. How great is that? Right? We never had these tools before. And on the left, in the red, you see the protein, the amyloid protein. This is the one that we're really trying to fight. And on the right, you see the tau protein, and it's also doing a lot of damage in the brain. But the point is, we can see them now. So this gives me a lot of hope in terms of developing new therapies because I can see what I'm doing. I'm not blind anymore to the effects of my drug in the brain. So that the advances in the science is something I'd like you to take away from this. It's just so powerful now in a way we've never been able to do. And we do these scans right over at the LaRuvo Center for Brain Health, and they're right here in Nevada and Las Vegas, and you don't have to go to New York City, where Josie is, to get a great scan. So what's Alzheimer's disease? Well, it's a progressive memory and cognitive decline. Of course, that's what you know. People lose the ability to function, and they have increasing dependency, and that's why we have to supply all of the kind of help that we do in order to respond to the presence of this brain disease. Why does it happen? Well, I've told you, I think, most of the story. This protein accumulates in the brain because we can't clear it. Some people can't clear it normally, and that sets off this whole chain of the tangles and the inflammation and the cell loss, and that leads to the dementia syndrome. So we have a pretty good understanding of the story of Alzheimer's disease in the brain, and we're getting better at intervening. Now here's a question that comes up all the time. Is Alzheimer's disease hereditary? Right? Most of you are here because you know somebody who has Alzheimer's disease, and therefore you're worried about their family, their children, their brothers and sisters. And here's what we know about the genetics. In very rare families, the disease is passed on directly from person to person. It's called a mutation in the gene. And if the child inherits the mutation, they will inevitably get the disease. But that is a very rare situation. There's a huge family in Colombia with this problem. You might have seen this on 60 Minutes, where they're doing some very exciting research in this huge family that has this inherited form of Alzheimer's disease. But it's probably only about 1% of all Alzheimer's disease. So about 99% does not have this direct inherited form. But what about 60% of patients have is a risk gene. So there is an important genetic component, and that, because 60% is most patients, right? Over 50% means most. So 60% of people with Alzheimer's disease have a risk gene, which they have inherited from one of their parents. So it works like this. If you don't have one of these risk genes, then your lifetime risk of getting Alzheimer's disease is 15%. So you can get it without the gene. Okay? But it's pretty low, pretty uncommon. If you got the gene from either your mother or your father, your lifetime risk is about 30 or 40%. So pretty high, right? That's a very powerful gene that would change the risk by more than twofold. If you were in a circumstance where you got this gene, one copy from your mom and one copy from your dad, the likelihood you're going to get Alzheimer's disease is probably at least 80%. It's very high. So this is a powerful gene. So again, it increases the risk from 15 to 30%. That means if you have one copy, a majority of people with one copy still do not get it, right? 70% don't get it. But most people who have two copies do get it. So this gene is very powerful. We work a lot with it. People say, well, should I get the gene tested? And at this point we say no, because we don't have a treatment for you. So even if we knew that you were positive, and the gene is present in about 20% of the general population. So in general, about 20% of the people in this room have this gene. But we don't recommend that you get tested for it because we don't have an intervention that hinges on whether or not you have the gene. We do test it in every patient who participates in our research programs at the Cleveland Clinic. So we know a lot about this gene. We can come back to the hereditary nature. I hope I've been clear that it's rare to inherit Alzheimer's disease, but it is not very uncommon to inherit a risk of Alzheimer's disease. The risk means that you're more likely to get it, but you are not inevitably going to get it. So Alzheimer's disease begins much earlier than we thought. So here's a kind of schematic. Starts with a healthy brain. Hopefully that's what we have here. And then let's say that the onset of the disease is about 70. Then about 15 or 20 years before that, this protein that we've been talking about begins to accumulate in the brain. 15 or 20 years. So if the person's onset of the symptoms is 70, we're talking about getting the protein in the brain at 50 or 55. That's when Alzheimer's disease starts. Okay? We think of it as something that affects older people. As a matter of fact, it is a midlife disorder. Begins at 50 or 55. About 5 years before 70 then, memory loss begins, and then you have the onset of the actual Alzheimer's dementia. So this is a long period of time. How do we know this? From these great scans we have, right? Because now we've started screening older people, and we can see that around, we've started screening younger people, and we can see that around 50 or 55 they start to accumulate the protein in the brain. And if they have the protein in the brain, it's a huge, huge risk factor for going on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So we're shocked by this reconfiguration of Alzheimer's disease. So here's what's happening. The protein is accumulating in the brain, and it's occupying more and more space in the brain, and that's true of both the amyloid protein above and the tau protein below. Now, this also helps us to identify the stages of Alzheimer's disease. So we have normal older people who have amyloid in the brain, and we're trying to figure out ways to help them. Then people go on to have abnormal memory, but normal function. And then we diagnose Alzheimer's disease itself when people have both abnormal memory and abnormal function. So that's the progress through life over this 20-year period. Now here's just some of these scans that I'm showing you. So on the top row are the amyloid scans. Okay, and you can see that on the far left, there's just a little of that red signal, and that's really normal. And then right from what we call the early or preclinical, right to the prodromal, where there are just mild memory changes, right to AD dementia, there's a lot of that protein in the brain. You can see that. Now the tau protein is very interesting because there's very little of it at normal aging, And then it progressively gets more evident in the brain over the stages of no symptoms in preclinical disease to mild symptoms in prodromal disease to severe symptoms in Alzheimer's dementia. So that's what's going on in the brain. And in the meantime, the brain is shrinking. And that's what the MRIs on the bottom show you, is that there's more and more shrinkage and loss of the brain substance. So from a biological point of view, this is how I see the evolution of Alzheimer's disease when I do scans on people. Now the great thing is, this has so helped us understand how to do better trials for Alzheimer's disease. And there's only one way to get new treatments for Alzheimer's disease, and that is through clinical trials, because it is the only kind of information that the FDA will accept. And so to get an FDA approval for a medication that we could provide to everybody in the world, there is only one way to get there, and that is through clinical trials. And that's why we do many clinical trials at the Cleveland Clinic. We usually have 10 or 15 at any one time trying to find drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So how would this work in this evolution that I've told you? Well, if we discover people who have normal memory, but they have a positive scan, then we give drugs to try to prevent the occurrence of any memory impairment. If we discover people who have mild impairment and they have a positive scan, we give them drugs to try to prevent dementia from occurring. If we discover somebody with dementia and they have a positive scan, we give them drugs to try to keep them at the highest possible level. So we have true prevention trials, we have trials for very mild people, we have trials for more moderate and severe people. That's the only way that we can develop new drugs. And we have a horrible history. We haven't had a new drug approved since 2003 for Alzheimer's disease. 2003, memantine. Many of you know memantine. That was the last drug approved for Alzheimer's disease. We have a horrible record. We have a 99% failure rate of drug development. But with these new tools, we're going to get better and better at this, because we know what we're doing. We're not shooting in the dark anymore. So this is just to show kind of how the protein accumulates in the brain and how it becomes more and more common with aging, and that's why Alzheimer's disease is an age-related disorder. Well, new therapies are coming. I want to give you a little hope here. So I think it's helpful to know how a drug is developed. I've emphasized the importance of clinical trials and that's the only way to get a new drug. So this whole process starts in the laboratory. We hope at UNLV. And somebody makes an observation about something that happens in a mouse. And they say, okay, well, I think we can target that, and therefore we'll start developing a new drug. They get it ready, and then we have to do what's called a phase 1 clinical trial. Phase 1 clinical trial are normal volunteers, because this drug has never been in a human being, it's only been in mice. So, got to see, well, is it safe? How long does it last in the blood? What does it do? Who does this, by the way? Well, I was in Washington not too long ago, and I was taking a cab ride, and the cab driver said, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm an Alzheimer guy. And he said, oh, you know, I volunteer for these trials. And it turned out he was a phase 1 unit volunteer. So he drives cab part-time and he volunteers to take drugs that nobody knows about part-time. You know, what a great life. And he's really helping science. So that's what phase 1 is like. People get the drug first. You start off with a very low dose, and then you give them higher doses, and then you give it for 1 day, and then you give it for a couple of weeks, and then at the end of that period you say, okay, well, I think it's safe enough, I'm going to try to give it to some of my patients. That goes to phase 2. These are very small trials. They're usually maybe 100 or 200 people. And we see, well, does it make the Alzheimer's disease better in some way? And if that all looks good, then we take it to phase 3. These are huge trials now, usually about 1,000 people in these trials. Of course, they're not just done in one city, they're done all across the country and sometimes all across the world. So at the Lou Rugo Center, we might bring in 10 of the 1,000 patients in the trial. And so it's a big collaboration all across the United States or all across the world. That trial goes well, it goes to the FDA. The FDA says, yeah, got a drug here, they market it, and therefore we can make it available to everybody in the world. So that's a general process. How long does it take? 13 years. 13 years from the time it starts in the laboratory to the time that it could finally be approved by the FDA. So it's a long process. It also means that the drugs that we're working with right now were discovered 10 years ago, right? In a way, they're already 10 years out of date in terms of the new science. But there's just so few ways to accelerate this process. And that's why we do it. This is what we're involved in, but I want you to kind of have a sense of the complexity of this. And by the way, this drives me wild. You see these headlines, breakthrough in Alzheimer's disease. It's almost always in a mouse. Do you know how many mice we've cured with Alzheimer's disease? And literally, there are about 300 drugs that have cleared that protein in the mouse, and not one of them has worked in a human being. So if mouse dementia was a major problem, we're like on top of it, you know, we're on top of that. But it hasn't been very helpful in terms of human dementia. But that's where you hear the breakthrough. Eventually, one of those breakthroughs is going to break through, but they haven't yet. So here's a figure from and you have it in your handout there, a little easier to see. This is a figure that I publish annually in an Alzheimer's disease journal. It's a figure that includes every drug currently in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. Every drug. So what are some observations here? And the way it's done, so you see it's 3 circles, right? The inner circle are the drugs that are closest to FDA approval. They're at phase 3. The middle circle is at phase 2. They have a ways to go. And the outer circle is phase 1. They've just come out of the laboratory and gone into the human beings. The green part at the top, those are all drugs that you have to get intravenously. The purple on the right are drugs that you take by mouth, and the drugs on the left in the orange are drugs that are meant to change behavior, for example, in very agitated patients, or change depression in depressed patients with Alzheimer's disease. So we're testing all sorts of different drugs. A couple of observations. One, there's about 110 drugs on this map. That's every drug in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, at any phase. That is pathetic. If I were to show you this map for cancer, there would be 3,000 drugs on this map. 3,000. That's how you make progress in treating a disease. You have lots of drugs which allow for lots of failures and a few winners, right? Because 10% of winners out of 3,000 is a whole lot different than 10% of winners out of 100, right? So we're just not testing enough drugs, and we need much more going on in the Alzheimer world in order to get new treatments faster. The other observation that is very bothersome to me is you see that the outer circle has the fewest little dots in it. Can you see that? You see when you look at it, the outer circle has the fewest little dots. Well, those dots are the ones that are going to go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. So if we don't have very many dots out at phase 1, we're certainly not going to have a lot of dots in phase 2 and phase 3. So we need a lot more drugs coming into the pipeline. So that's why one of the reasons that I'm trying to move this along. So what can be done to speed up effective therapies? Well, we need more people to volunteer in trials. So one of my pleas to you is to consider trials or consider talking with a person that you know that has Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment. I was just looking at the figures for the update of that publication. We need about 50,000 people to volunteer for trials. 50,000. Trial site and trial network efficiency, that's something our group is working on. We need to get more drugs into the pipeline. I've made that point. Too few drugs at phase 1. And we need to attract more scientists and more companies into drug development. They're just too little. That's one of the things I want to do at UNLV, is to attract more scientists into this. Well, a healthy brain. This is what I want to leave on so that we can have plenty of time for questions. A healthy brain lifestyle can reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So here's one way of thinking about it. This is based on the literature. What are the things that increase your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease? And this applies to you and to me and to everybody in the world. Age, right? So we've said it starts younger than we thought before, but it still is an age-related disorders. ApoE4, this is the risk gene I told you about. Female sex, being a woman, and there are a lot of women in this room, increases your risk for being Alzheimer's disease. Now, women live longer, so that is one reason that they're more likely to get it. But even when you account for that, women are at greater risk for Alzheimer's disease. We're not sure why. It might have to do with menopause. Diabetes, obesity, hypertension are all risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. These are also risk factors for vascular conditions, and that's why we say what's good for your heart is good for your brain. Because if you can reduce these things, you're less likely to get Alzheimer's disease. Depression and stress are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Head injury is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. You know, we're very worried about this in athletes, right, in the NFL, about athletes who are having a lot of head injury and now turning out to get dementia. And smoking is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Well, what are the things you can do to reduce your risk? Well, education turns out to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So I always think, you know, one of the great things about this lecture is I feel like I'm just reducing your risk for Alzheimer's disease, just a tiny amount, you know, and that by being here today, you're reducing your risk for Alzheimer's disease. How great is that? How great is that? And it's free. How free. Most powerful way to reduce your risk is physical exercise. And this is very important. And we can see the break point at about 30 minutes 3 times a week. So, you know, you don't have to go out and do kickboxing. 30 minutes of vigorous walking 3 times a week will reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So that's important. Diet and nutrition. A diet that is high in antioxidants, if we look across the world, is associated with reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease. So people who have a lot of fruits and vegetables, this is no mystery, fruits and vegetables in the diet reduces your risk for Alzheimer's disease because they're antioxidants, and the way the protein injures the brain is through oxidation. So if you can get more antioxidants into your brain, you reduce the risk of the protein injuring your brain. Socialization and brain fitness, you know, those little games that you do, or volunteer, or come to a clinical trial, all of those things will reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And good sleep is really important because it turns out, very interesting physiology we're learning now, the protein is cleared from the brain during sleep. So if there's inadequate sleep, that is one of the contributing factors for why that person is not clearing the protein from the brain. So sleep is really important. So this is some great work by a friend of mine, Christine Yaffe, who just mapped kind of the percentage of risk factors in the United States. So about 30% of the total risk of Alzheimer's disease is due to lifestyle effects. 30%. You see that, I'll just call out a few of these: diabetes, 3.3%, hypertension, about 8%. Depression, look at depression, 14.7%. Physical inactivity, 21% of the risk. And then about half of the risk is due to unmodifiable factors that we can't help. But there's a fair amount of the risk for Alzheimer's disease that can be reduced, and I think it's important to do so. So at the Cleveland Clinic, we built something called the 6 Pillars of Brain Health. Our website, by the way, is healthybrains.org. So healthybrains.org, and we emphasize food and nutrition, antioxidant diet, medical health, make sure your diabetes and hypertension are controlled, mental fitness, volunteer and play games, physical fitness, make sure you exercise, sleep and relaxation, critical, and social interaction, very, very important. So when you put all that together, you have what we call a healthy life and a healthy brain, and you can find all that on healthybrains.org. So in summary then, what I'd say is that Alzheimer's disease is a really complex disease of the brain. And it includes these plaques, and these tangles of plaques are from this protein, and the protein appears to set off a whole series of events that are injurious to the brain. These new brain scans are so helpful to us. They're just telling us so much that we were never able to see before. They're going to help us develop new drugs. Alzheimer's disease begins in midlife, around 50 or 55. That's when the protein starts to accumulate. So we're really rethinking the disease now. New drugs are promising. We've got, I should just tell you a little bit, I didn't show you any of the specific drugs. We have 2 drugs that are, that you infuse in the vein, and we have brain scan evidence that they dramatically lower the amount of protein in the brain. In fact, they convert in a majority of patients from a scan that is positive to a scan that is negative on the scanning, which is a dramatic reduction. And with that reduction in the protein, we are seeing stabilization of the cognitive decline. Not improvement, but stabilization. And of course, if we could stabilize decline, that would be a huge gain for us. So we're really excited about that. There's also a drug that's being developed in China. Looks pretty good on the preliminary data that we've seen. And I think it's possible it's going to be approved in China. So we're watching that drug very closely, and we'll have a worldwide dialogue about it if it does get approved. And then finally, brain health reduces your risk for Alzheimer's, and I encourage all of you and me and my family to get involved and stay brain healthy. So I'll stop there, but I really want to take questions. Yes, ma'am.
I know that alcohol was mentioned as one of the factors, alcohol. What about drinking alcohol? I don't think alcohol.
So alcohol is really interesting. So alcohol in excess, drinking too much, getting drunk, produces a dementia. But it does not produce Alzheimer's dementia. So dementia means impairment severe enough to cause functional loss. And it includes many, many things. It includes stroke, it includes hypothyroidism. A lot of it is due to Alzheimer's disease. Some of it's due to alcohol. There's also a very interesting set of data that I believe that showed that mild to moderate use of alcohol is associated with reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, the first study came out of Bordeaux, which made it a little suspicious, but it has been confirmed by other scientists from other regions. So a glass, and red wine has more antioxidant in it, and it might be the antioxidant content of red wine, or it might be an effect on stress, for example, or something like that. That's also a risk factor. So low levels of alcohol appear to be risk reducing, but high levels of alcohol can be dementia inducing. So that's how we think about it. How about, yes ma'am, over here.
Please wait for the microphone.
What is the correlation between Alzheimer's and dementia with Huntington's disease?
So the question is about Huntington's disease, and Huntington's is another one of the dementias. So I mentioned that dementia is the big concept, and Alzheimer's disease is a very common cause of dementia. And then Huntington's disease is a disease that strikes younger people, usually around 35, and it has a movement component to it, so they have abnormal movements, but they also get a dementia syndrome, so it's one of the other causes of dementia. Now, one of the things that I'm really excited about from a scientific point of view is it turns out that many of the processes that are going on in Alzheimer's disease are also going on in other dementias, like Huntington's disease. And a breakthrough in one, something we learn in Huntington's, might tell us about Alzheimer's. Something we learn in Alzheimer's might tell us about Huntington's. For example, there's another protein that accumulates in Huntington's. So the very fact that we know that there's a protein accumulating in Alzheimer's has helped us think about the role of these proteins in other disorders. So the science is in a really exciting point right now. Yes, ma'am. And then we'll come to you, sir.
Thank you for your speech, sir. My question is, when you mentioned some of those chronic diseases like hypertension or high blood pressure, diabetes, they might end to be an Alzheimer problem. So can we call Alzheimer is a chronic disease as well?
Yes, yes. So the question is can we think of Alzheimer's as a chronic disease? And I think ever more so, because we have pretty good evidence that this brain health brain health lifestyle, for example, can slow the disease even in somebody who already has it. We think of it primarily as a prevention, but even in somebody who has it, if they're able to participate in some of these activities, it seems to be good for them. We have some drugs that are approved, right? And they're not great drugs, but they're better than no drugs. So we use them. We can treat depression, which is a common complication. So more and more, Alzheimer's disease is moving into this category of a chronic disease, and less of thinking of it as a sort of inevitably fatal outcome. Because we can manage it. And when we get the stronger drugs that are in the pipeline now, and I truly believe they're coming, it'll be even more like managing a chronic disease. We have no cure for hypertension. We have no cure for congestive heart failure. We have no cure for chronic lung disease. But we manage that very well for people, and they have decent lives. And that's my goal for Alzheimer's disease. The likelihood we're going to cure it when it's a product of this slow protein accumulation in the brain that goes on for years, are we going to cure that? I don't think we're going to cure it. But are we going to make people's lives better? Absolutely, we're going to do that. Yes, sir.
What's your recommendation of the Biogen product?
Yes, so the question is, what about the Biogen drug? This is like an investor comment, should I put my life savings on the Biogen stock here? The Biogen drug is one of the best looking drugs in the compound, in the pipeline. It's called aducanumab. Okay. Yeah. No, thank you for being part of a trial. That's a really great example of participating in a trial. And it's one of the best looking drugs we've seen. It's one of the drugs that converted the scans from being positive to being negative. So we're really excited about that drug. Yeah. But it takes a couple of years, to get everybody all the way through. Yeah, okay. Okay, yes, exactly. Yes, well, thank you for being in the room. Very good. 50. Wow. Hold them to that deal. Yes, sir.
Around the world, they have different deals, but some people live longer. Is there any places that Alzheimer's doesn't show up?
Only in people who die very young. So it is really interesting to look at the worldwide distribution. There's some evidence that the prevalence is lower in India. And the Indian diet is particularly high in antioxidants, which those might be related. I don't know that that's why they have less, but it's at least a plausible idea. Because curcumin, for example, is a really powerful antioxidant, and that's what you use to make curry with. So eat curry tonight. Go home and have curry, and know that you're helping prevent Alzheimer's disease. So, but if you look worldwide, it doesn't vary too much. As long as people are living into the risk age, they're getting at kind of the same rate with these kind of minor variations. It leads to a very interesting consequence that by 2050, the population of China will be so high that 60% of all Alzheimer's disease people will live in China. 60% they'll have, just because the population is so huge that proportionately they will have many more dementia people in the population. So the differential aging in the population affects the worldwide distribution. Like the United States kind of has a stable population now. We have about as many people being born as we have died. So we're kind of in a stable situation, and we're not going to have a great explosion of Alzheimer's disease. It's going to become more common because we have more people aging, but it's not going to be an explosion the way it is in China, where they just have so many more people aging. Let's see, how about right here? I'm glad to see these questions.
Will you please explain the correlation between stroke and Alzheimer's and/or dementia?
Yes. So that's a really complicated question, one that scientists are trying to work out. There's a few ways of thinking about it. One, stroke can produce dementia. That's one thing. So particularly if you have multiple strokes, you might have more likely to have dementia. Another thing is that many people with stroke have Alzheimer's disease in addition. And we've discovered that through these scanning. So they have a stroke, and we scan it, and they have the amyloid protein in the brain. A third way of thinking about it is that this protein that I've shown you in the brain is also present in the blood vessel. And so people who have Alzheimer's disease are also more likely to get stroke because of this protein in the blood vessel. So there are many ways in which the vascular changes and Alzheimer's disease are intertwined, and for any one person, it takes a very careful working out with MRI scans and amyloid scans to try to figure it out, what's contributing to what. Yes, ma'am.
Psychotic drugs for the mentally ill.
Say that again.
The psychotic drugs that they use for mentally ill, like schizophrenic. Is there any way that these drugs have an effect on the brain towards dementia or Alzheimer's?
Yes, so the question is about what about the powerful drugs that we use for schizophrenia and psychosis. They do not appear to be risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. There's no increased prevalence in people who have used them. We occasionally, of course, have to use them in Alzheimer's disease because occasionally Alzheimer patients develop odd beliefs that motivate them to do things that might harm themselves or others. And so we occasionally have to use these drugs. It is one of the areas where we're trying to develop better, safer drugs for Alzheimer patients. And my program has been very actively involved in that particular type of drug development. And it hasn't happened yet, but we're still hopeful that we can get drugs that will help people have higher quality lives, but won't sort of sedate them, make them spacey, all of the things that they are vulnerable to with these drugs. Yes, sir.
Dr. Cummings, thank you, first of all, for your time and what you do. You mentioned dementia being the umbrella, and there's Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And can you go into a lot of folks explain Alzheimer's and say, oh, it's dementia, it's vascular dementia, but it seems like I don't know if it's synonymous or where it really is the differences in treatment as well?
Yes, right. This is a very common sort of confusion in the terminology because I'll have people say to me, well, Mom had dementia, but thank God she didn't have Alzheimer's disease. But of course, if she had dementia, she had about a 60 or 70% chance of having Alzheimer's disease as the cause of the dementia. Because dementia is just a general term, and Alzheimer's disease is by far the most common cause of dementia in older people. But there is, but that understanding of the relationship of the two words is not very well known. And so some people use them as if they're two distinct categories. They are not. Alzheimer's is a subset of all of the dementias, but it's a very large subset of all of the dementias. Yeah.
So then would it be critical to really diagnose which one an individual has then, to really focus on the treatment?
Yeah. So that's a really great question. At this point, it's probably not too important because the drugs that we have, the drugs like Aricept and Memantine, actually have been used with some success in both vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease, for example. When we get to the very specific drugs that are attacking that protein that I showed, we're going to need to show that that protein is actually present because you don't want to give someone an intravenous infusion every month or even every 2 weeks for a protein that is not in the brain. So we're going to have to do the scan, know that that protein is in the brain, and then decide on the therapy when it comes to this kind of anti-protein therapy. But I'd say right now, it's not really critical because our therapeutic options are fairly non-specific. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to know, the 13 years it takes to get to market, how much is involved in the FDA?
In the FDA, usually 18 months. And they're trying to cut it down. There are a couple. Thank you for opening this up because I think there's some misbeliefs about the FDA. I've met with the FDA many times now, and I think they really want to help. One of the recent FDA commissioners, had a father with Alzheimer's disease, and I think they want this as much as we do, and so they're trying to help. But their responsibility is to Congress to protect the public health. It's actually not to sort of, prove a drug is efficacious. That's up to the company. Their mandate from Congress is to protect the public health from charlatans and misleading advertising in drugs that might not be helpful but cost a lot of money. So they're scrupulous in doing that. The other thing is that people often believe that there are a bunch of drugs around the world that have not been allowed into this country because of the FDA. And I mentioned this very interesting drug in China, and it is the only drug in the world that looks like it's succeeding in Alzheimer's disease that is not available in the United States. And it hasn't been approved in China yet. We think it has a good chance. I'll just contrast the two agencies because I think it might be helpful to you. To get a drug approved in the United States, you must show that it improves memory and that it improves either function, the ability of the patient to live a more normal life, or sort of globally improves the patient. And there are these global scales. In China, you have to show that the drug improves memory and it has at least a trend for functional improvement. So the standard is just a little lower, so a drug approved in China would not necessarily be approved in the United States. And there's a lot of dialogue about, well, are the FDA standards too high and they're keeping drugs out? or the Chinese standards too low, and they're making drugs available that aren't going to be that effective. And we're just going to see this play out in the context of this exact drug. But I wouldn't want you to think about, to go away thinking, well, there's a bunch of drugs in Europe, and if I could just, get my mom over to Europe, there would be a lot of drugs I could give her. Just isn't the case. Every scientist in the world is having the same struggle we're having here to develop new therapies. Follow-up question. Well, whoever names these drugs, I think, should be replaced. The drug that you mentioned and that we have a lot of confidence in is called ADU, A-D-U, CANU, C-A-N-U, M-A-B, aducanumab. Let's say that together, aducanumab. And the other one that we think is really good from this protein point of view, and we'll be starting a trial on this one soon, is called BAN, B-A-N 2401. Maybe that's a lucky number. Yes, sir.
Grain sugar, have they found out any of that causes problems with Alzheimer's?
Grain sugars.
Grain,
Yeah. I don't know about that specifically. Sugars in general are not well handled by the brain in Alzheimer's disease. It's one of the reasons that we had actually just completed a test for insulin. Didn't help, but it needed to be tested because of the difficulty that the Alzheimer brain has with handling different kinds of sugars. But I don't know the specifics of grain sugar, so I can't help you there. It is a kind of active area of investigation. Over here, yes.
Yes. So I just wanted to know why the protein gets removed during sleep, and if it's removed during waking hours as well.
I heard sleep, but I didn't get that.
Why is the protein that you referred to get removed during sleep, and whether or not does it also get removed during waking hours?
I wish I had a really good answer to that. What has been seen is when you put a catheter in and follow people for several days, a catheter in the fluid that surrounds the brain, you can see that during the sleeping hours is when the protein is being cleared from the brain. You can actually see that in the fluid. It's fantastic. But why that's happening has not been explained yet. We have many diurnal rhythms, right? Being awake during the day and sleep during the night is the most obvious. Well, we have many biological rhythms embedded in that, and this is one of them. But why it's occurring during the sleep and not during waking, for example, simply hasn't been explained, at least that I am aware of. Yes, sir.
Has sonic therapy or electrotherapy been tried or been used to see any changes or improvements?
I'm sorry, did you say electrotherapy?
Yeah. And sonic?
Yeah, there are several trials right now of different kinds of brain stimulation, both superficial and deep, that are looking at it. I'm not too hopeful about them because Alzheimer's disease involves so many cellular areas in the brain. And the areas like Parkinson's disease, or the disorders like Parkinson's disease, where deep brain stimulation has been so successful, the pathology is also very focal. So you can, put that electrode in there or that stimulus in there and know that you're affecting the exact area most affected in Parkinson's disease. Well, in Alzheimer's disease, it's fairly broadly affected. So for me, sort of the logic of the electrotherapies is missing from the way it has been so successful in Parkinson's disease. But none of us can tell the future, and that's why we test a lot of things that we're not quite so certain about, as long as we think they're safe, because we know we don't have all of the answers, and we want to be open to answers that we don't anticipate. Yes, sir.
So two things that you mentioned that I thought was interesting was the plaques in the blood vessels, and also a gentleman here asking about sleep. and how important it is, and that's the phase, the time when the body will flush out the plaque. What's your perspective on Seroquel or even any other sleeping agents to keep, for treatment to help? And also, is there a correlation with blood pressure and the plaques in the blood, kind of like atherosclerosis or something similar?
Yeah, two good questions. I'll answer the second one first. There's no known relationship between high blood pressure and the protein in the blood vessel. There's, of course, a relationship between high blood pressure and stroke in general. So you see these interactions, but not with that specific protein in the blood vessel. And then sleep, these sedatives. So we think sleep is important, and if I have to use a sedative to allow somebody to sleep, I will. But I don't like to, because Alzheimer patients are particularly prone to the confusing effects, the confusion effects of sedatives. So in the morning, they'll have more of a confusion, more hangover. One of the really great things that I'm particularly excited about is there's a new class of drugs that are not sedatives, but they restore the person's diurnal rhythm. So they help people sleep at night, and they help people stay awake in the day. That's what we want, right? That's what we want. So Merck has this drug that has been approved for use in people, including the elderly, called suvorexant. And suvorexant has now been tested in Alzheimer's disease, and the results of that trial will be announced in the next few months. But we believe that this class of drugs is going to be helpful because they act in a much more natural way. We're not just trying to knock somebody out, right? We're trying to restore the rhythmicity that would be normal, so they sleep at night and are awake during the day. And I think that's a much better goal in terms of our management strategies.
Similar to melatonin?
Yeah, melatonin has been tested in Alzheimer's disease and did not have any detectable effect. So many people have had experiences with melatonin that they say was helpful, but when we put it into a trial, we tested a high dose and a low dose, and we were unable to see a sleep benefit in Alzheimer's disease. And I think we're coming to the end of our time. How about one more question here?
Is there any evidence that medications that we have taken in the past, such as Prempro, levothyroxine, diabetes medications, metformin, any of those have had an impact on our propensity to get Alzheimer's or dementia?
Yeah. So I think you heard the question, are there any drugs that have an impact on Alzheimer's disease? This is a really active area of investigation called repurposing. And here I'm talking about drugs that might improve Alzheimer's disease. Because I mentioned that there are very few drugs coming into phase 1, right? So that's a problem for us. But if drugs are already approved, then they don't have to be tested in normal volunteers. Therefore, you get to skip phase 1 and go right to phase 2. That's a really fast way to develop new drugs. And that's called repurposing. That's why we tested insulin, because there was a good body of evidence that suggested that insulin might be useful. It was not. There's currently a high blood pressure medication that is being tested, telesmartin. It's not quite right, telemarstin maybe. And it looks like it reduces the protein of Alzheimer's. And it's so interesting that you mentioned metformin, because metformin in animals extends their healthy lifespan. And not all diabetic drugs do that, but metformin does. And so metformin is going to go into a trial where the consequences of aging are what's being looked at. So a combination of cardiac disease, joint disease, lung disease. I don't think brain disease is actually included in this particular trial, because in the animals, metformin prolongs normal, healthy life. So we want to see whether that's true in humans. There is not, to my knowledge, any drug that has proven to increase the likelihood of Alzheimer's disease. There are several of these really interesting drugs that look like they decrease the likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease, and now they're being tested as repurposed agents. Can I take one more? Okay, I got it. Okay, one more, she says. But Josie is, she's not to be meddled with, so this is really.
If you've had an incident or two of cancer, is there any more likelihood you're going to get Alzheimer's?
Yeah, the question is, is there a change in the prevalence of cancer in Alzheimer patients? I would say there does not appear to be. There was a concern for a while that there might be a higher incidence of lymphoma in the same families that get Alzheimer's disease. But that doesn't seem to have held up over time. So right now we can't see a relationship between cancer and Alzheimer's. Thank you all very much. Really great question.
All right, full disclosure, I call Dr. Cummings the rock star of Alzheimer's disease. Let's give him another round of applause, please. So when Alzheimer's comes into your life, as many of you know, because how many people in the room are caregivers? Can I get a show of hands? Yeah. And what was it like when this disease first entered your life? Overwhelming? Yes. Confusing? Devastating. Okay. So when Alzheimer's comes into your life, it can be overwhelming and life-changing. Our next speaker, Kim Boyer, is a certified elder law attorney with the Boyer Law Group. She practices in the area of elder law, estate planning, guardianships, and probates. Please welcome Kim to sort of navigate the journey for us.
Hello, so I'm going to talk about the issues that I've seen facing families when somebody has Alzheimer's disease. And I've been practicing here in Las Vegas for 23 years in elder law, and I see some of the people here who are professionals in the field, and also some clients and social workers here. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and please feel free to ask questions, or we can hold them to the end and we'll get those answered for you. So one of the first steps, once you've received a diagnosis, is it's recommended to have a family meeting and financial assessment. Because in putting together a plan, you need to have the proper information as well as find out some basics. So with the financial assessment, we want to take a look at income and assets. Sometimes people do come in to talk about what can be done, and they don't even have a good picture of what there is. So it is important to take a look at that. Then also to find out what are your concerns. While a person still has the capacity and ability to give their input, it's very important to get that information and putting together a plan, and then asking, what are your goals? Just some simple examples are when somebody has received a diagnosis and they're still able to communicate, someone might say, well, I'm very much okay with doing whatever my daughter says. And someone else may say, well, I do not want, under any circumstances, to live with my daughter. And that's really important to me. I love her, but that would not be something I want. So in having this family meeting is to take a look at what the goals are. And also in the family meeting is to take a look at where you are right now. Sometimes people have already put together a pretty good plan, and it only needs a little bit of tweaking, and other times people have not looked at anything at all, and they're kind of starting from scratch as to what do you need to address, what do you need to think about. so that it's important to see where you are and putting together the plan for where you're going to go. So it's good to develop a checklist of items to consider. Think about who's going to be the primary caregiver, and then to find out what other type of support and other resources might be available to the family. A lot of people want to stay at home as long as possible, and that's usually what most people want. And so what can be done to accomplish that? Who's going to be the caregiver? What kind of resources will be there for them? And then at some point, a lot of times the family members can no longer care for them at home, and that's when you take a look at other options, when the care potentially gets to be too much for the family. So that's when it's important to have that financial assessment, because in taking a look at what type of plan you're going to put in is knowing what you have. For some people who are very fortunate and have a good deal of assets and income, basically they can self-fund the care and not have to worry about it, and they can just choose the level of care that they want, the place that they want, and have that as their plan. Where the assets and the income are more limited, then you might be taking a look at stretching it out, taking a look at other alternatives, and possibly even seeking public resources for potential care costs in the future. Once you've had the family meeting, financial assessment, and you have sort of a snapshot of where you are, sort of the next step in the plan is to start in putting together a plan giving your circumstances. And this is where it is helpful to get input from professionals, not just with an elder law attorney, but with people who are involved in care planning as well. Then part of the care planning part of it is looking at the care options and getting an idea of what makes sense for the family. As I said, a lot of people want to stay at home as long as possible, and that's what I hear most frequently when a loved one gets the diagnosis, is I want to keep them at home as absolutely long as possible. And sometimes that is what works, and a lot of times there's the need for additional help to make that happen. So with staying in your own home, what can you get to help you stay in the home? Respite care for the primary caregiver, having additional people come in, potentially relocating. Sometimes I've seen that. So mom gets Alzheimer's, daughter says, please come move in with me. Me and my husband are gonna take care of you. And that can be a viable option for a period of time. When a home, yours or someone else's, is not the place that is going to work, there are other options out in the community. Adult daycare, that's where somebody goes for the day or several days a week, but comes home at night. In-home care, when you need additional help that not family can provide, moving in with children. Assisted living facilities and group homes, and continuing care retirement communities. And then finally, this is what no one wants to be in, is a nursing home, being institutionalized. That's generally last resort. So part of the plan, it's great to know what the options are, then how do you pay for the cost of care? So again, family members provide a substantial amount of uncompensated care, and it takes quite a toll on the caregiver. One of the statistics I read is that caring for somebody with Alzheimer's will end up shortening your life. It's a challenge to do so, but it's part of what you do as families. When you love somebody, that's what you do, you step up. But at times, no matter how much love you have, it is simply too much. And what do you do at that time? Who pays for long-term care? The largest percentage is out of your own pocket. You're going to use your own income and your own assets to pay for the care. The next biggest slice on there is Medicaid, which is a needs-tested program with very specific rules, and we'll talk about that. Medicare is a lot less than one would think. Some people who haven't come to get educated in a seminar may think, well, I have my Medicare, I pay taxes all these years, and there's going to be care available for me when I need it, and the answer is not for custodial care. Medicare specifically excludes custodial care. And so there's no coverage for that. Custodial care is not the type of care where you're improving, it's simply where you need help with your activities of daily living. Long-term care insurance is the smallest part of the slice, and that is where you have purchased care insurance through an insurance company to pay for care. For people who have it, it's excellent. It's a fantastic way to pay for care in your home, an assisted living facility. Why do more people not have it? Primarily, the premiums are expensive, and you have to be qualified for it. So once you have a diagnosis, generally speaking, it's too late. Nobody's going to underwrite you. And so it is encouraged for people planning ahead to consider long-term care insurance. So long-term care insurance, again, is a great option for paying for the cost of care. So sometimes after a family member has gone through the process, and people are now looking at their own plans, that's another thing that I see is, okay, my mom had Alzheimer's, we went through all of that, we don't want to have this happen to us, or we want to minimize it or make it as smooth as possible. What kinds of things can we do ahead of time? And the federal government really encourages people to purchase long-term care insurance to basically pay for your own long-term care in the future. So it's strongly encouraged that people do consider it. What I have found, though, is that the people who genuinely purchase it are those who have substantial assets and income anyway and could more likely self-fund. And then the people who are in the middle, who are looking at it and say, well, I really just can't afford that premium, generally don't do that. If you are thinking of getting it for yourself, inflation rider is very important because the cost of care just continues to rise. The average cost of nursing home care in Nevada is over $8,000 a month. Now that is in a skilled nursing facility. How many people could afford $8,000 a month? Not very many. Now that's the skilled nursing facility, that is the highest level. If you are at an assisted living facility or memory care, those can still run from $4,000 to $7,000 a month. In-home care, generally that people will charge around $20 an hour. It depends on the number of hours that you're using, but you can take a calculator and take 20 times 24 times 7, and you're looking at over $12,000 a month. I mean, that is very expensive. That's why family members are generally the ones providing a substantial amount of uncompensated care at great cost, not just to have the stress that it goes on for you, but if you then step back from the workforce, then you're also losing out in there and your credits towards retirement. Yes. Pardon me?
What was the hourly rate?
Oh, the $20 an hour is the general rate for if you're going to go through an agency. That's generally the rate for a caregiver. And some people choose not to go through an agency because you can find somebody who will move in and do that at less. And there's a web page on there where people specifically ask for people for caregivers and provide caregivers. And so you can go through that. There's just a lot of challenges when you bring a stranger into your home to provide care and you want to do a lot of due diligence. And that's what the agency has already done. And of course, you're paying more. So you have to do that cost-benefit analysis on that. Medicaid. That was the second biggest chunk up there of how people get their cost of care paid for. Medicaid will pay for custodial care, but you have to meet the guidelines. They have income rules and they have asset rules. So with your countable assets, for a single person, you have to spend down to $2,000 to be eligible for Medicaid asset-wise. Exempt assets, the primary one is the house with a limit on the equity. Car, funeral, life insurance, and household goods. So those are the basic rules for getting eligibility for a single person for Medicaid. So worst case scenario, Medicaid is there. Somebody who goes through all their income and assets, paying for the care, Medicaid would be there, that will pay in a Medicaid facility. We also have a home and community-based waiver program in Nevada, which is viable. You cannot be over the income cap for those services, but it's a viable program in Nevada. Now, there's a federal law and Nevada law that says that if you're married and your spouse is getting sick, you should not have to go through all of your assets just because your spouse is going to end up in the nursing home. So there are some protections for the spouse. The spouse can petition the court for division of assets and income to set apart the federal maximum in assets and income. And for some families, it really makes a lot of sense. The spouse, community spouse at home can keep the assets, and then the other spouse goes to the nursing home and Medicaid pays. But it's not a lot that you can set apart to the community spouse. It is the amount that's determined to not impoverish you. Right now, that amount is about $126,000 plus the exempt assets. So, for example, if a married couple has about $100,000 in the bank and a house, then that's sort of like the perfect case where you can do the division of assets. The spouse keeps the $100,000, it doesn't go to the nursing home, plus the house because it's exempt, and then Medicaid would pay for the cost of care in the nursing home. If you have more than that, there are some things that can be done for asset protection. The sooner, the better. There's a disqualification period. So, can you just give your assets away and be eligible for Medicaid? No, they have a 5-year look back under current rules. So when you apply for Medicaid, they're gonna look back 5 years to see if there were any asset transfers. Minus any of the exclusions, they're going to have a disqualification period. So some of the pre-planning that can be done is you can make asset transfers either outright or to an irrevocable trust, but you need 5 years. Some attorneys call it 5-year planning. What I've found is when people come in and they're healthy, it's like, well, do you want to give all your assets away in the event you might need a nursing home in the future? And most people answer that question, no. They really don't want to give their assets away in the event they might need a nursing home in the future. But when it comes time to the crisis planning, people are wishing they had done the asset transfers. So some of the planning ahead may be, are there some assets that you want to make sure get passed on that you're not going to need? Then you can do some of that 5-year planning. The house is an exempt asset under the Medicaid rules, but it is subject to Medicaid estate recovery. So here in Nevada, they have aggressive Medicaid estate recovery, and they will go after the house afterwards, so they'll pay for Medicaid, the Medicaid will pay for the care, but at the death, they will lien the house to try to recover. Now, there are some exceptions to the recovery, there's always exceptions. And there are things that you can do ahead of time to protect against the Medicaid estate recovery. So sometimes people will come in and do really a basic pre-planning where we'll take some steps to protect the house from the lien and get in some of the basic tools, which we'll talk about later, some of the tools in the toolbox available for putting together the plan, given your circumstances. But this is a big question that we get asked, is how can I protect my assets from long-term care? So these are just a summary of what we talked about, that long-term care insurance, and that's what the federal government really encourages people to do. Some people don't want to purchase long-term care insurance because they think, oh, I'm going to pay all these premiums for something I hope I never need. So the financial product industry has come up with a new product that is basically life insurance with a long-term care rider on it. So for example, you give $100,000, they put a long-term care rider on it that if you need long-term care, they're going to give, just for example, $300,000 worth of care. But if you never need the care, your beneficiaries will get that $100,000 so that you are not paying these premiums for something that you may never use. That's a new product that the financial industry has come up with. The irrevocable trust or the 5-year planning, and then the Medicaid division of assets. or a combination. So those are the primary ways for protecting assets from long-term care. If your loved one is a veteran, there are some great benefits available. If your loved one is a wartime veteran, served during a period of war, did not actually have to be in the theater of war, they can be eligible for a benefit called aid and attendance, where if once you meet the criteria, it can provide over $2,000 a month in tax-free income that you can use for the care. This is a great benefit, and what it allows then is, for example, somebody at home or an assisted living facility whose income is not enough to either pay the person who's providing care in the home or to pay the assisted living facility, with this benefit can make the difference, and that person can stay at home longer or stay in an assisted living facility. So it's a great benefit. The veteran had to have served during the period of war. The surviving spouse of a wartime veteran can also be eligible for this benefit. The amount is about half, so $1,000 a month. But again, that $1,000 a month can make the difference. So this is an excellent option out there for veterans, wartime veterans, and their surviving spouses. Now, if the veteran has a service-connected disability, there are some additional benefits available. Now, one of the important things about planning ahead is to put your plan in place while you still can. So at the initial time of the diagnosis, frequently the person still has capacity if it's caught early enough. Sometimes people are in denial for way too long and they refuse to go to the doctor, and by the time anybody ever gets them there, their capacity might be gone at that point. But generally speaking, the person is still going to have capacity and be available to get planning in place. So definitely want to try to do that while you still can. So now we'll turn to some of the legal tools and strategies for getting a plan in place. And it's important to be thoughtful at each step and to put together a solid plan. So some of the tools in the toolbox, and you've no doubt heard of these. Power of attorney for healthcare. This has to deal with your healthcare decision making. It does not have to do with the finances. So while you can make your own medical decisions, you get to make them. But when you lose the ability to understand the nature and consequences of your decision, then you can no longer make those medical decisions. It is strongly recommended that everyone have a power of attorney for healthcare. We have a statutory form here in Nevada. You do not have to go to an attorney to get a power of attorney for healthcare. You just need to make sure it's validly executed. And make sure you're naming a person who will make your healthcare decisions for you, and really have a backup in place. We had a case many years ago where mom did do her power of attorney for healthcare. She named her only son to make the medical decisions for her, and then nobody after her. Mom was in the nursing home, son got Alzheimer's. And so now son's wife is dealing with all the things that come when you find out your spouse has Alzheimer's, and son was helping out his mom in the nursing home. And so the wife knew that was one of her duties. That was one of the things that she was going to do, was help take care of mother-in-law. But she did not have the legal authority. That meant guardianship. And guardianship should be avoided at all costs. And so it's important to get these tools in place. Have your power of attorney for healthcare. We don't like to think that something's going to happen to our children before us, but this part of planning is you plan for the worst, hope for the best. So having those contingent decision makers in these documents is very important. So to really think about who you want and make sure you have those in place. Power of attorney for assets. This deals with the finances. So you need your husband's IRA to pay for some expenses, and he loses capacity. Are you able to access that IRA? No, solely in his name, unless you have a valid power of attorney for assets, naming the spouse as the agent to make those decisions, and ideally then a backup as well. So a power of attorney for assets is very important to be able to manage assets that cannot be placed in a trust. Wills, last will and testament, deals with the disposition of your assets at death. Trust, revocable and irrevocable. These work during lifetime. So you create the trust, assets go in, and you can provide terms in there that specifically deal with the type of care that you want or don't want, because they provide asset management during your lifetime. So your successor trustee would manage the assets, and you can be very specific about the type of care you want or don't want. We had one case where the woman had sufficient assets and she never wanted to go into a nursing home, and so she put into her trust, if I ever go into a nursing home, these beneficiaries will receive nothing and all my money is going to go over here. So do you think she stayed at home? Yes, she did. She stayed at home. So trusts have that ability to manage the assets during lifetime and put your specific terms in there and what's important to you. Gifting of assets, that is something that can be done. Again, it creates disqualification periods. Entitling of assets, you want to make sure how they're titled. A lot of times we'll come into where we're putting together a plan and there's a piece of property titled to somebody else, and then you need that person's authority. Advanced directives. These are the documents that deal with healthcare decision making. If you can't make medical decisions, who would make them for you? We talked about the power of attorney for healthcare. There are actually 4 types under Nevada law, and advanced directives are state specific. The other one is the living will. It's a shorter document. If you do not want to be sustained in your terminal, you would execute a living will. DNR, do not resuscitate. That is a form that has to be completed by the doctor and the patient or the patient's authorized representative. POST is the 4th type of advanced directive. Provider's order for life-sustaining treatment. Has to be signed by the patient or the patient's authorized representative, and then one of the medical providers. These are important documents. You do not need attorneys for these, but these are really important for your healthcare decision making, and encourage you to take a look at those. And here in Nevada, you can tender those into our Living Will Lockbox, a free service by the Nevada Secretary of State. So again, in that durable power of attorney for healthcare, very important, where you name the person who's going to make those healthcare decisions for you, and you can state your wishes regarding what type of treatment you want, what type of treatment you don't want. And those wishes are to be honored by your agent. It also gives your agent the ability to have access to your medical records and to talk to your doctors, which can be very important. So again, strongly encourage you to get your health care documents in place. And again, no attorney necessary, but make sure that they are executed properly. In Nevada, question over there?
Excuse me, if you have a durable power of attorney and recommend individual 1, and then you have a HIPAA with the doctor named individual 2, which will be controlled.
So the question is, there's a power of attorney for healthcare that names individual 1, and there's a HIPAA release that names individual 2. Which one is controlling? It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. The power of attorney for healthcare is a broader document. That person named is going to be able to make the healthcare decisions. They will also be considered an authorized representative under HIPAA to have access to the medical records. So it's broader. The person named under the HIPAA release will only be entitled to obtain the information as specified in the HIPAA release. They're not going to be able to make the medical decisions once the agent has been determined to lack the ability to give those informed consent.
So the HIPAA person can only access records and has no say in treatment.
Correct. So the question is, the HIPAA person can only access medical records and has no say in the medical treatment, and that's correct. So again, just make sure they're executed properly. Question over there.
I'm sorry, but many of us have lived in other states and chose Nevada to retire here. I had all this done when my attorney back home. I have it in the folder. It cost me a lot of money. How valid is all that here right now?
Excellent question. She had all of her planning done by an attorney in another state, paid a good money for this. How valid is it here? It will be honored here. There is a specific statute here in Nevada that says if your documents are valid in the state where they were created, they're to be honored here. So if you went to an attorney, and most likely those are good documents and they're going to be honored here. So you do not have to redo them. Question?
Yes. On the, what do you call it, the health, if you sign it and you have it notarized and you leave it with the hospital, is that sufficient?
Question, on the healthcare document, if you sign it and leave it with the hospital, it's sufficient? So again, the power of attorney for healthcare, attorney not needed, but you want to make sure it's executed properly. If you're executing the Nevada form, the Nevada rules are the power of attorney for healthcare, it has to be signed in front of 2 witnesses or in front of a notary. So you just signing it, meaning it's not going to be valid. So you have to sign it in front of your 2 witnesses or notarized. If you do the witnesses, at least one witness has to be unrelated and not entitled to inherit. And we have a statute in Nevada that if you are a resident in a hospital, nursing home, assisted living facility, you have to have a certificate of capacity attached to it. But if you're signing it before you go to the hospital, you don't need to have that certificate of capacity attached to it.
But they will honor it, right?
Yes, and then you give the power of attorney for healthcare to the hospital, they will honor it. Now, the power of attorney for healthcare only goes into effect when you can't give informed consent. So once you sign the power of attorney for healthcare and you name your agent to make your medical decision for you, the doctors will come to you first for informed consent. They'll come to you to make sure that you're understanding and give that informed consent. It's only when you lose the ability to give your informed consent, they will then let the agent make that decision.
But if you don't have an agent?
If you don't have it, and that's one of the things with the power of attorney for healthcare is you have to name an agent in that document. If you do not have an agent, it's not valid. So I've heard from some people, well, what if I don't have anybody who's going to make these decisions for me? If you don't have any family, are there any friends? And then worst case scenario, you don't have family or friends, we do have a public guardian who, and I don't know if they will serve under agents, under power of attorney for healthcare, but I've seen them named under wills. We have somebody from the public guardian's office here today. And you can name somebody like that, although realistically it's really great if you can find a family or member or a friend, if not public or private guardians. Now ideally you want to avoid the guardianship, but naming them would not necessarily lead to a guardianship. They would just be able to act under your power of attorney. But you do have to name the agent. If you don't have an agent, there are the other documents. You can still do a living will. You can do a DNR if you're terminal, and you can do a post if you're terminal. So you can do those, and those documents don't require you to name an agent. So you can have the others. That's why there's 4 types of advance directives. Sometimes we ask, well, there's 4, what do you need them all for? They each serve a different purpose. Yes?
So how do you handle a case where the person looks like they're capable, but in reality they're not?
So question is, how do you handle a case where the person looks like they're capable, but in reality they're not? I mean, and that happens so frequently. It boils down to what is a physician going to say on the legal side. On the legal aspect of it, does the person have capacity? And generally that's an opinion that would get rendered by a physician, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist to make it the opinion as to whether somebody has that capacity. So a lot of times people refuse to have that evaluation. We see that a lot. You know, the person showing all these signs, the loved one's worried about them, things are going downhill, what can be done? If that person refuses, it's really unfortunate, but sometimes you have to wait for the bad thing to happen before you can intervene. I really hate that because it's like you want to come to be proactive, but sometimes it is the bad thing happens, and at that point, you step into place.
So my question is for after that.
Yes.
So you have that determination already, but in the hospital, how does the doctor know that you have that determination and not to go straight to?
Now, one thing about capacity too is people can come in and out of capacity, generally not with Alzheimer's disease, but the doctors, you would let the doctor know of the capacity evaluation, but the doctors are going to then make their own assessment. So they're going to talk to the patient about a specific treatment, unless you have a guardianship in place, to determine whether they understand the nature and consequences of that decision. Because that's what they have to do for their ethical rules. They're to get that informed consent from the person, treat them with respect and dignity, and so they'll be talking to that person. Again, they have to understand the nature and consequences of their decision. And that is very slippery. Somebody might one day and not the other day, or they might on a simple question, but not on a more complex question. So if you do end up with a guardianship and you have a court-ordered guardian in place, now the person who has the ability to consent is the guardian. But even under guardianship, there's a push towards, dignity and getting input from the person and honoring what they want to the extent it's not harmful. Yes? Oh, the question is, can I explain a pulse? And I think we've got a slide up on each of these, so we'll go through them. Okay, living will. This is the second type of advance directive. It's a shorter document. You state whether you want life-sustaining treatment to be used if you're terminal. The third type is the do not resuscitate order, and that is, again, if somebody calls 911, they have a legal duty to resuscitate. They don't have time to look at documents. They just will resuscitate. But if you complete a do not resuscitate form, send it into the health district. In Nevada, they will issue this bright salmon-colored card, and if that's shown to the emergency personnel, they will not resuscitate. The fourth type of advance directive is the PULSed form, and this is newer form because there's holes in these documents. They don't cover every situation, but they're better than not having these documents in place. So with the PULSed form, this has been designed to have something that is at the level of an advance directive, but you don't have to go through the same procedures to execute it. And the idea behind it is a lot of times when somebody receives a diagnosis, or they will say, I want everything done. But as they move along in the disease process, they say, no, that's not what I want. They can have a conversation with the provider, document it, and it's now effective. So that's what the PULSE form is, a provider order for life-sustaining treatment. We have a sample form, and pulse.org in Nevada will have that, and it's filled out by the patient. The patient has capacity, and the provider, and you check your categories. Do everything, do nothing, or in between one where you can check. Well, I want antibiotics, I don't want antibiotics. I want oxygen, I don't want oxygen. So you can specify that. It goes into your chart, it follows you everywhere, and it's to be honored. If you lack capacity, then your authorized representative can complete it, which is your legal guardian if you have one, the person designated in your living will, person designated in your power of attorney for health care. You can also have a surrogate signing. So the PULSE form is a newer option here in Nevada, and it's starting to go across the other states in the United States. Living Will Lockbox, free service by the Secretary of State where you can tender your advance directives. And then if somebody were to present at a hospital and nobody's with them, they look to see if any of these have been in place. Under Nevada law, if you don't have these documents in place, they have to provide treatment. So if that's not your wish, you really need to get this in place. That's why I strongly encourage everybody to have these documents. We have a substituted judgment statute where people haven't put these in place. These people are allowed to make certain decisions, but it's very limited to life-sustaining. And again, if you're putting in a plan ahead of time, get these advanced directives on the healthcare side in place. On the financial side, I strongly encourage people to get the power of attorney for finances in place so that somebody can act on the financial side, minimize the need for a guardianship, because you really want to avoid guardianship. Guardianships are expensive and really intrusive. You definitely want to avoid it. Probate is the process after death, how assets get distributed. Generally, when you're putting together a trust, that is the primary focus of estate planning, is where your assets go at death. You can, as I said, put terms in there that deal with what happens during lifetime. But if you don't do any plan and you die and you have assets just in your name, it's going through the probate process. And a lot of people want to avoid probate process. So it's part of the overall plan of what you're going to do with your care and the cost of care during your lifetime is getting assets where you want after death and avoiding the probate process. Assets go basically what I call 3 different buckets. If an asset's titled in a person's name only with no beneficiary designation, it's going to have to go through that probate process. Assets in trust will be governed by those trust terms. So for those of you who have already done all of your estate planning and you've got your nice trust binder and you've got all of your assets in trust, all good. You're not going to end up going through the probate process, and everything will be governed according to those terms. So that's good pre-planning ahead of time. Joint tenancy beneficiary designations, those pass by operation of law. If you have an asset held jointly, a lot of people like that, husband and wife, let's put everything in joint tenancy. First one dies, it goes to the survivor, which, with everything is going on smoothly, that's generally okay. But when there are bumps in the road, there are problems with joint tenancy. One is with Alzheimer's. I've seen that. Husband and wife own a house. Husband gets Alzheimer's, wife decides this house is just too big for me and I'm going to move out of it now. Wants to go to sell it, and her husband lacks capacity. They can't sell the house without going to guardianship court unless she did that power of attorney for assets. So it's very important to have that in place. Beneficiary designations, you put beneficiary designations on your assets, it will pass to them, and that avoids probate. It doesn't generally cause problems during lifetime. Revocable trust is a great tool for planning not only for disposition at death, but at life, so that you can put in terms in there that are important to you. And you can also look at your beneficiaries afterwards and make sure that it's set up for the way that you want. Sometimes we've done planning for somebody, we get them eligible for Medicaid, and then we get the phone call. Oh, my dad's going to inherit a bunch of money from a cousin. What happens to that money? Well, if they were on Medicaid, they're going to come off of Medicaid, generally speaking, because that money has come in. And you can avoid some of those by doing good planning ahead of time. If your beneficiaries, people that you want to leave money to, have special needs, you can get that into your documents. Take care of details. You want to make sure you selected appropriate decision makers and that they are available and backups in place. When I talk about the importance of backups, get quality estate planning. Make sure your trust is funded. So for those of you who have your nice binders and you've been there, make sure it is funded, because we have seen people that've gone to the attorney's office, they check that off the box. I've got my planning in order, put it up there. Now, 10 years later, they've opened an account trying to chase a better interest rate, and they didn't put that new account in the trust. So is that account governed by the trust? Not immediately. No. So it's going to either, you're going to have to use your power of attorney if it's during lifetime, or it's going to have to go through probate after death. So you want to make sure the trust is properly funded. Safeguard those estate planning documents. The nice binder that you have, make sure it's safeguarded, and the originals are safeguarded, and the people you've named know where to find that. So we've had cases where we've ended up in guardianship court. Guardian goes in, tracks down documents because nobody knew about those documents. And then those documents will be, in most cases, honored, but now you've gone through this added expense. So make sure they're safeguarded and your people named in there know where they can be found. Master list of assets. It's one of the first things about doing that financial assessment. So many times I ask the question, what do you have? People don't have that answer. So you want to provide that roadmap to the person who's going to step in and inform the successor trustees. So those are some important details to take care of and making sure that the plan is implemented. If you are thinking about 5-year planning, you've got your revocable trusts and gifting available. A lot of people don't want to do that, but it is an option out there. Some people ask, well, can I just put my money in a revocable trust and have it not be counted for Medicaid? And the answer is no. A revocable trust is considered available, so it's not an asset protection trust. Guardianship is a tool out there, and so if somebody has not done their planning and they lose capacity, you can go into court and get appointed as guardian. Family members have priority. There are private guardians and the public guardian. The public guardian's office is very busy in Las Vegas because there are a lot of people who don't have family or friends who are willing to step up and serve and who didn't do any kind of planning ahead of time. So in guardianship, you have to be over the age of 18, never judicially determined to have committed abuse, neglect, exploitation, isolation, or abandonment. And then you can petition to be the guardian. You have to file all sorts of reports with the court. Your care plan, your budget, your inventory, your annual accounting, your annual reports. And there's a great deal of oversight. And for people who retain attorneys, it is expensive. For people who do it on their own, I've had people say they've looked at all the new rules and regulations that have gone into place and are close to tears in dealing with that. So again, it's really encouraged to put a plan in place if you can. Get those assets into the trust. Once you have done the trust and safeguard those originals, those are really important to, once you've done the plan, to basically safeguard your plan. Now over time, you might want to update your plan, and when would you do that? We talk about the 4 Ds, death, divorce, disability, and debt, are certain times when you would want to update your plan. So for example, if you do receive the diagnosis of Alzheimer's or other dementia, oftentimes that's a good time to have your plan looked at. And we do that, we'll take a look at plans, and sometimes we'll talk with them and say, your plan is good, it does not need any updates. And other times that might be when the planning needs to be updated. Or you put together a great plan. Husband was going to take care of wife who has Alzheimer's, and he was going to do everything possible. And husband gets cancer. Then the initial plan is kind of out the door, and you look at putting together a different plan. And then once your plan is in place, the people who are named as the agents is to be an advocate for your loved one. So you want to choose somebody that's going to do a good job. Choose someone who is going to advocate for you. If one of your family members cannot do what you want to have done, don't name them. Don't put them in that position. Name somebody else. And then that person's duty is to be the advocate. So sometimes family members, once they make the decision that they can't provide the care and they place them into a facility, the role changes from being caregiver to being advocate. And it's very important to be the advocate, to make sure they get good care. And that's a huge role too. You want to make sure that you take a break. Very important. Because we have seen cases where the caregiver is just running themselves ragged, and then their health declines, and now where did that plan go? So, and I know it's hard sometimes. You get in the midst of the caregiving and someone says, take an hour break. I can't. It's very important to take care of yourself, utilize respite, and take that break so that you can continue to be there for the person that you are taking care of. And we all know about the negative effects of stress and what it can do. So again, anything that you can do to take care is a gift. No matter what you plan, you put in place, sometimes the unexpected will come up, and it's good with taking the break, it gives you more of the resources to be able to handle the unexpected, the things that just come up, no matter what type of plan that you put in place. But it's still very good to get your plan ahead of time. Protecting your legacy, and wrapping this up, what kind of legacy do you want to leave? So we talked about getting the healthcare plan in place, getting your financial plan in place, and safeguarding it. And part of being a caregiver for somebody and taking care of them is that you are demonstrating your love and your duty. And the people who are watching you, for example, your children and grandchildren, you are teaching them what it means to be a loving and good person. Any questions? Yes?
As the daughter, when their assets, when parents' assets are gone, how much are we leaving responsible?
So question, daughter, after the parents' resources are gone, what is your legal responsibility? Here in Nevada, none. A child, adult child, does not have a legal obligation to pay for the parents' expenses. But, well, now, the question is, well, does the care just continue? Privately paid care, yes. Privately paid care will end if you don't, once the assets are gone and the income is not sufficient. And that's where you look at applying for Medicaid. But then it will only be in any place that takes Medicaid. Question, they'll be living in Texas. Yes, and so you'll need to take a look at what is available in Texas. There's similarities, but rules vary from state to state because Medicaid is a joint state and federal program. Yes?
As far as Medicaid trying to get their money back for what they paid, is that different in every state?
Question, as far as Medicaid estate recovery, is that different in each state? And the answer is yes. In order for a state to get federal money, they have to comply with the federal rules. But the method of how they implement it varies from state to state as long as they don't violate federal law. So one of those is estate recovery, substantially varies. Some states that are not wanting to do very limited recovery, just enough to meet the federal guidelines. Nevada is as aggressive as it gets. So if you're in another state, you want to consult ideally with a certified elder law attorney. They're going to know what the rules are, what types of things that you can do ahead of time to protect assets.
When you said make sure the trust is funded, did you mean essentially
My bank accounts have to say estate of?
So the question is, when I talked about making sure your trust is fully funded, what exactly did that mean? So for those of you who have a trust, or who later are thinking of executing a trust, and now you have it. You have a trust, the trust is in place, but your assets need to get retitled into the trust. So for those of you who have it, you may not notice, when you get your bank statement in the mail, up in the corner, it should say your name, trustee of your trust, under a specific date. If it's on the bank statement, it's titled in trust. Your real property will be titled in trust. It will have you as trustee of your trust, or whoever the trustee is. So that is how you make sure the assets are titled in trust. And if they're not titled in the trust, then they're not going to be governed by the terms of the trust until you either use power of attorney to get them in, or after death, you have to go through the probate process. So you do want to make sure. We see that a lot of times. People have done that. They've done the trust, but then they switch their assets around and they don't get those assets into the trust. So it's really good. You want to make sure you have a fully funded trust and to look at your beneficiary designations. The items that can't go into trust, like your IRA, those cannot be in a trust. Your IRA, your 401k. Who's the beneficiary? And is that beneficiary still alive? We have cases every year where we're handling a probate case because an IRA named beneficiary died first. So you want to make sure you look at who your beneficiary is and put in those contingent beneficiaries. So you want to take the time to do that. Oftentimes the beneficiaries are not listed on the account statement that comes in the mail. It's not up in the corner. It's in some document somewhere. So you want to do the research when you're putting together that whole list of all of the assets, all the income. Look at the beneficiary designations and all the important papers. It's really Saves a lot of time if you get all those in place. Any other questions before break? Oh, one more question and then it's break time.
The question is the 5 wishes as binding as the trust contract? What is this? The other contract?
The question is the 5 wishes binding? And the answer is yes. 5 wishes is a document that is like a power of attorney for healthcare, but it's a lot broader. There's some very specific questions in there, and a lot of families find that very helpful to go through that and fill it out. And we have a specific opinion here in Nevada that it constitutes a valid power of attorney for healthcare because it is valid in Nevada, executed properly, and it's a great way to help you at that family meeting kind of go through what's important. And they have some great questions to help you start thinking about things that are important to you and help you all together put in that plan. So thank you very much.
Does that take the place of the pulse? Because I went to the hospital and I had the 5 wishes, and they said it's not necessary. You could do just the pulse. It's exactly the same thing.
A question is, does the 5 wishes or power of attorney for healthcare take care of the pulse? 4 types of advance directives. You could have all 4. They each serve a different purpose. I think the power of attorney for healthcare is broader of the 5 wishes because you're naming the person to make the medical decisions for you. The pulse, you're having a conversation and documenting what you want when you're at the hospital. The hospital likes that because they have it documented right there. And then they can just follow it without talking to anybody because they've already talked to you. So 4 types. There are tools available, and they all serve their own purpose.